One of the biggest mistakes we make when trying to understand someone's feelings is believing that words are always more honest than behavior. We hear a man say, "I don't care," or we watch him act completely casual, and we immediately take that at face value. But human beings are far more complicated than that. Sometimes what a person says is what they genuinely feel. And sometimes what they say is what they need you to believe. That's where things become interesting. Because a man can tell you that you're just a friend, act like nothing about you affects him, and still somehow know when your mood has changed. He can't pretend he's too busy to care, yet remember something you mentioned 3 weeks ago. He can act completely relaxed around you, but suddenly become more attentive when you start pulling your energy away. And this is where I want you to become more psychologically observant, not suspicious, not obsessive. Observant, because the goal isn't to turn every little gesture into evidence that a man is secretly in love with you. That's not emotional intelligence. That's projection. The goal is to learn how to recognize patterns without forcing a conclusion. There is a profound difference between looking for signs and looking for confirmation. When you're desperate for someone to like you, you can take almost anything as a sign. A delayed text becomes, "He's playing hard to get." A compliment becomes, "He's secretly obsessed with me." A glance across the room becomes, "He can't control his feelings." But when you are emotionally grounded, you don't need one moment to tell you the truth. You watch the pattern. And patterns are difficult to fake over time. Think about attention for a moment. Attention is one of the most valuable currencies we possess. We have limited time, limited mental energy, limited emotional bandwidth. So when someone repeatedly directs their attention toward you, it tells you something about where you exist in their internal world. This doesn't necessarily mean romantic attraction. That's important. A person can care deeply about you as a friend, colleague, or family member. But if you're trying to understand whether there is something more happening, repeated attention becomes meaningful when it appears alongside other forms of investment. Does he notice small changes in you? Does he remember details you casually mentioned? Does he create unnecessary reasons to interact with you? Does he seem unusually interested in what you're doing? Does his behavior toward you differ from the way he behaves toward everyone else? These questions are far more useful than asking yourself, "Does he secretly like me?" Because the second question encourages fantasy. The first encourages observation, and there's something else happening psychologically here. People often reveal their priorities through what they notice. When someone matters to us, our brain becomes more sensitive to information associated with that person. Their name catches our attention. Their mood becomes easier to recognize. Their preferences become easier to remember. You don't necessarily have to consciously decide to do this. It happens because emotional relevance changes perception. Imagine you're sitting in a crowded room. There are dozens of conversations happening around you, but suddenly someone you care about walks through the door. You notice you didn't have to tell yourself, "Now I must pay attention." Your mind did it automatically. That's why attention can be revealing. If he repeatedly notices you without seeming to make a deliberate effort to notice you, that's worth observing. Maybe you're quieter than usual, and he asks, "Are you okay?" Maybe you change your hair, and he comments on it even though nobody else does. Maybe you mention a small problem one week, and the next time you see him, he asks whether you resolved it. Those moments may appear insignificant, but psychologically they tell you something important. You occupied enough space in his mind for that information to remain there. And this is where many people misunderstand attraction. They think attraction is primarily expressed through dramatic gestures. Flowers, confessions, romantic messages, grand declarations, but often, before someone makes a dramatic move, attraction appears through much smaller behaviors. Attention, curiosity, proximity, memory, consistency. The man who doesn't care generally doesn't need to manufacture distance. He simply lives his life. Your presence doesn't create much psychological disturbance. But the man who is trying to hide his interest may behave differently because he is managing an internal contradiction. Part of him wants connection, another part wants control, and that tension can create strange behavior. He comes close, then pulls away. He starts a conversation, then suddenly becomes casual. He remembers everything, but pretends he doesn't notice. He seems interested, then acts indifferent. Now, here's where you need maturity. Don't romanticize inconsistency. Just because someone is conflicted doesn't mean you should wait around indefinitely for them to resolve that conflict. That's one of the most important distinctions in understanding attraction. A person can have feelings for you and still be incapable of giving you a healthy relationship. Those are two completely different questions. The first is, does he feel something? The second is he willing and able to act on those feelings in a way that creates something meaningful? And you should care much more about the second question, because your life cannot be built around decoding someone else's emotional contradictions. If he likes you but never communicates, never makes an effort, never takes responsibility, and never moves toward you, then his hidden feelings don't give you the relationship you want. This is why I want you to pay attention not just to isolated gestures, but to effort. Effort is where attraction becomes tangible. If he remembers your favorite coffee, but never makes time to see you, that's interesting, but incomplete. If he compliments you, but never shows genuine curiosity about your life, that's pleasant, but incomplete. If he watches your stories every day, but never makes an effort to actually know you, that's attention, but not necessarily meaningful investment. You see the difference? We're not trying to collect clues. We're trying to understand behavior, and perhaps the most revealing sign is what happens when you change your own behavior. When you stop initiating every conversation, does the connection disappear? When you stop constantly making yourself available, does he make an effort to reach you? When you become less focused on getting his attention, does he suddenly seem more interested in getting yours? This isn't about playing games, it's about removing the noise, because sometimes you can't see someone's level of interest while you're doing all the work. If you're always texting first, always planning, always checking in, always keeping the conversation alive, then you don't actually know how much effort he would make without your constant participation. You're measuring the relationship with your effort included. Take your effort out for a moment and you get new information. And that's powerful, because when you stop chasing someone, you're not necessarily making them miss you. You're giving them the opportunity to reveal whether they were ever moving toward you in the first place. That distinction can save you months, sometimes years, of emotional confusion. So when a man acts like he doesn't care, don't immediately believe the performance, and don't immediately reject it either. Watch, listen, observe, look for repeated attention. look for memory, look for curiosity, look for effort. Look for the subtle ways his behavior changes around you, and most importantly, don't allow your desire for an answer to become stronger than your commitment to reality. Because the most emotionally powerful woman in the room isn't the woman who can perfectly decode a man's hidden feelings. It's the woman who can see the truth without needing the truth to be different. And once you develop that ability, you stop asking, "How do I make him show me that he cares?" You start asking the far more powerful question, is what he naturally gives me enough for the kind of love I want? That question changes everything. And this brings us to something even more revealing, because sometimes you don't discover what someone feels by giving them more of your attention. You discover it by stepping back and seeing what happens when you're no longer doing all the emotional work. Now, I want to be very careful here because stepping back is not the same thing as playing games. I'm not telling you to disappear for 3 days because you saw some dating trick online. I'm not telling you to deliberately ignore his messages so that you can make him anxious, and I'm certainly not telling you to manipulate someone's emotions just to prove that they care. That's not confidence. That's strategy disguised as insecurity. What I'm talking about is something much healthier. Stop overfunctioning in the relationship. Stop being the person who always starts the conversation. Stop being the person who constantly creates opportunities to see him. Stop filling every silence because you're afraid of what the silence might mean. Stop giving 90% of the energy and then trying to interpret the 10% he's giving back. Because sometimes the reason you're confused about someone's feelings isn't that he's particularly complicated. It's that your effort is covering up the truth. Think about that. If you're always initiating, you don't actually know whether he would initiate. If you're always checking in, you don't know whether he would notice your absence. If you're always making yourself available, you don't know whether he would make an effort to gain access to you. And this is where psychology becomes incredibly useful. Human beings are often influenced by perceived availability and perceived loss. We tend to pay more attention to things when we realize that access to them isn't guaranteed. You see this in everyday life. Something can be sitting in front of you for months and you barely notice it. Then suddenly it's gone and you realize how accustomed you had become to having it there. Relationships can work in a similar way. When someone knows that your attention is guaranteed, they may become passive about receiving it. Not necessarily because they're cruel, sometimes because human beings adapt to what feels certain. Certainty can become invisible. But when certainty disappears, not because you're manipulating them, but because you're returning your attention to your own life, the other person suddenly has to confront a question. Wait, where did she go? And that question can reveal something. Maybe he reaches out. Maybe he becomes more curious. Maybe he suddenly starts initiating conversations. Maybe he finds a reason to see you. Maybe he notices that you're quieter and asks whether something is wrong. Or maybe nothing happens and that answer can be just as valuable. In fact, sometimes it's the answer you've been avoiding. Because we often spend enormous amounts of energy trying to interpret someone's lack of effort. He's shy, maybe he's scared, maybe he's been hurt before, maybe he doesn't want to seem too interested, maybe he's testing me. And yes, sometimes those explanations are true. But here's the problem. An explanation is not the same thing as evidence. You can explain almost any behavior if you're emotionally invested enough. And this is why stepping back is so powerful. It doesn't create the truth, it reveals the truth. If there is genuine interest beneath his indifference, giving him room to act creates an opportunity for that interest to become visible. And if there isn't, your stepping back prevents you from endlessly manufacturing a relationship that exists primarily because you keep pushing it forward. That's an incredibly important distinction, because there's a version of love that feels like pursuit. You're constantly trying to get someone's attention. You're trying to say the right thing. You're trying to look desirable enough. You're trying to become mysterious enough. You're trying to make him realize your value, and underneath all of that is a painful assumption. If I stop trying, I'll lose him. But if stopping your pursuit causes the entire connection to collapse, you haven't lost something that was securely yours. You've discovered that you were carrying it, and that's painful, but it's also liberating, because the goal of dating isn't to become so strategically perfect that someone finally chooses you. The goal is to discover mutuality. Mutuality means I move toward you, and you move toward me. I show interest, and you respond with interest. I make space for you, and you make space for me. I don't have to constantly convince you that I'm worth knowing. And you don't have to constantly convince me either. That's what healthy attraction begins to feel like. Not effortless in the sense that nobody tries, effortless in the sense that the effort is reciprocal. And this is why one of the most revealing signs of hidden interest is what happens when you stop providing unlimited access to your attention. Does he notice? Does he respond? Does he become more engaged? Does he begin investing? Now, there is another psychological phenomenon worth understanding here. Sometimes a person doesn't realize how much emotional space you've occupied until that space becomes quiet. When you're always present, your presence can become part of the background. But when you become absorbed in your own life, your work, your friendships, your ambitions, your interests, you stop being constantly available as an emotional resource. And suddenly, he gets to experience your absence. That doesn't mean you should manufacture absence. It means you should stop being afraid of it. There is a huge difference. The insecure person thinks, if I don't keep his attention, someone else will take it. The emotionally secure person thinks, if my absence makes him forget me, then I needed to know that. That's a completely different psychological position. One is fear, the other is self-respect. And here's something else that matters. Watch whether his interest is merely reactive or genuinely intentional. These are not the same thing. Suppose you pull away and he suddenly texts you. You might think, there it is, he cares, maybe. But what happens next? Does he actually make an effort? Does he ask meaningful questions? Does he create a plan? Does he maintain contact? Does his behavior become more consistent? Or does he simply reappear whenever he senses that you're moving on, only to disappear again once he feels secure? That pattern is extremely important, because sometimes what looks like attraction is actually a desire to maintain access. And those are very different things. Someone can dislike the idea of losing you without actually being ready to build something with you. They may not want you to leave, but they may also not want to step forward. And that creates one of the most emotionally exhausting dynamics you can experience. Enough attention to keep you hopeful, but not enough intention to give you security. Don't confuse those two things. If a man becomes interested only when he feels you slipping away, that's information. If he consistently moves toward you, even when there is no threat of losing you, that's information too. One is reaction, the other is intention, and intention is what you ultimately need. So if you're wondering whether a man who acts indifferent actually cares, don't become a detective searching for microscopic clues. Give reality room to speak. Live your life. Become busy with things that matter to you. Don't manufacture distance, but don't fear natural distance either. Don't punish him with silence. Simply stop doing the work that should belong to two people, then watch. Because when you stop chasing clarity, you create space for behavior to provide it. And perhaps that's the deeper lesson here. Your job isn't to make someone realize your value. Your job is to recognize whether they already do. Because love becomes exhausting when you're constantly trying to prove that you're worth pursuing. But it becomes powerful when you realize you don't need to chase someone into discovering what they would naturally notice if they were truly paying attention. So step back, not to make him chase you, but to see whether he chooses to move toward you. And once you've learned to observe what happens when you stop doing all the work, you begin to notice something even more subtle: emotional inconsistency. Because sometimes the truth isn't revealed by one dramatic gesture. It's revealed by the contradiction between what a person says, what they do, and how they react when something threatens to expose what they're trying to hide. Think about that. A man says, "I don't care," but then he notices who you're talking to. He says, "We're just friends," but he remembers tiny details about your life that most people would forget. He acts completely relaxed around you, but the moment you become distant, his behavior changes. He tells you he's not interested. Yet somehow, he always finds a reason to be near you. These contradictions are psychologically fascinating because they can reveal a conflict between internal emotion and external behavior. And this is important. We have to be mature about how we interpret them. Not every contradiction means attraction. Sometimes inconsistency simply means inconsistency. Sometimes someone is emotionally unavailable. Sometimes they enjoy attention without wanting commitment. Sometimes they're confused. Sometimes they genuinely don't know what they want. And sometimes, yes, they have feelings they're trying very hard not to reveal. Your job is not to force the most romantic explanation onto the evidence. Your job is to notice the pattern. Because attraction creates tension. When someone feels something but doesn't want to admit it, there can be a gap between impulse and behavior. The impulse says, "Move closer." The conscious mind says, "Don't let her know." So he moves closer and then pulls back. He asks questions and then pretends he wasn't interested. He gives you attention and then suddenly becomes distant. He wants to know what you're doing, but doesn't want you to know that he wants to know. And this is where you can sometimes see the psychology of self-protection. Vulnerability is uncomfortable. To admit that you care about someone is to admit that they have the ability to affect you. And for some people, that feels like giving away power. If I tell you I like you, you can reject me. If I tell you I miss you, you know you matter to me. If I tell you I want to see you, you know I have a desire for you. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional control, that can feel dangerous. So instead of expressing vulnerability directly, they express it indirectly. They tease, they linger, they watch, they remember, they find excuses to interact. They become unusually curious about your life. They notice when your attention shifts towards someone else, and then, almost immediately, they try to cover it up. It's almost as if they reveal themselves and then quickly attempt to erase the evidence. But here's where you need to be careful. Jealousy, for example, is not proof of love. A man becoming uncomfortable when another man talks to you may indicate attraction. But it could also indicate possessiveness, insecurity, competitiveness, or simply ego. So don't ask, did he get jealous? Ask, what does his jealousy tell me about the way he relates to me? Does he become more intentional? Does he communicate? Does he treat you with greater respect? Or does he simply become controlling? Because not every strong emotion deserves to be romanticized. That's a crucial distinction. We live in a culture where people sometimes confuse emotional intensity with emotional depth. But they are not the same thing. Someone can be intensely jealous and still be incapable of loving you well. Someone can be deeply attracted to you and still be completely wrong for you. Someone can miss you and still not be ready to build a relationship. And understanding that protects you from one of the biggest traps in dating, mistaking someone's feelings for their capacity. You don't just need to know whether he feels something. You need to know what he does with what he feels. That's why consistency matters so much. If his attention appears only when he thinks you're leaving, that's one kind of information. If he consistently shows curiosity about you, remembers things, makes time, respects your boundaries, and moves closer without needing to be chased, that's another kind of information entirely. The first may be emotional reaction. The second is emotional intention. And intention is much more valuable. Because the truth about attraction isn't found in a single moment. It's found across time. One glance means almost nothing. A pattern of attention means more. One compliment means almost nothing. Consistent admiration and curiosity mean more. One jealous reaction means almost nothing. A repeated pattern of emotional investment tells you much more. This is why I want you to stop obsessing over individual signs. Don't sit there thinking, he looked at me for 4 seconds. What does that mean? Instead ask, over the last few weeks, what pattern has this person consistently demonstrated? That's a much more intelligent question. And there's something philosophical about this. We often want certainty before we allow ourselves to make a decision. We want to know exactly what someone feels. We want a confession. We want a message. We want undeniable proof. But human relationships rarely give us mathematical certainty. At some point, you have to become comfortable making judgments from patterns. You don't need to know everything someone feels in order to know what their behavior is offering you. That's freedom, because perhaps the most important question isn't, does he secretly care? Perhaps it's, does the way he cares actually meet me where I am? Imagine a man who secretly thinks about you every day but never communicates. Imagine a man who feels strongly attracted to you but refuses to make a move. Imagine someone who becomes jealous whenever another man appears but won't give you clarity. Yes, he may have feelings. But what does that information do for you? If his feelings never become action, they remain internal. And you cannot build a relationship with someone's potential. You build it with their behavior. This is why I want you to pay attention to emotional congruence. When someone's words, actions, and intentions eventually begin pointing in the same direction, you have something solid. When they constantly point in opposite directions, you have confusion, and confusion can become addictive. That's another uncomfortable truth. When someone gives you mixed signals, your brain can become obsessed with solving the puzzle. Why did he say that? Why did he text me last night? Why did he disappear today? Why did he act jealous? Why did he suddenly become warm again? And suddenly, You're no longer experiencing the relationship. You're analyzing it. You're living in interpretation rather than reality. That's dangerous because you can become emotionally attached to the mystery instead of the person, and sometimes the mystery is all there is. So if you notice these contradictions, don't immediately chase an explanation. Observe. Give the pattern time. Look at whether his behavior becomes more consistent as the connection develops. Look at whether he takes emotional risks. Look at whether he makes an effort when there's nothing to gain. Look at whether he respects you even when he doesn't get the attention he wants. And above all, watch whether his actions eventually become clear enough that you no longer need to decode them. Because healthy attraction doesn't have to remain a secret forever. A man can be shy, he can be nervous, he can be uncertain, he can take his time, but eventually genuine intention tends to move toward clarity. And that's where your power comes from, not from figuring out every hidden feeling, not from becoming an expert at decoding male psychology, but from becoming so grounded in your own standards that you can observe someone's behavior without losing yourself inside it. You can say, maybe he likes me, maybe he doesn't, but I'm going to watch what he consistently does. That is emotional maturity. Because the goal isn't to win the guessing game. The goal is to recognize reciprocity when it appears and walk away from confusion when it doesn't. So yes, he may act like he doesn't care. He may hide behind casual words. He may try to convince you, and perhaps even himself, that you're not that important. But eventually, behavior has a way of telling the truth. And when you learn to read that truth without exaggerating it, romanticizing it, or being afraid of it, you become incredibly difficult to confuse.